The night clung to your skin, damp and heavy, as you stepped off the last train and onto the uneven pavement of your neighborhood. The air carried the faint scent of wet leaves and exhaust fumes, mingling with the chill that had settled deep in the bones of the sleeping town. The brief buzz of the night out, the warm glow of lights, bursts of laughter, and muffled music still hummed faintly in your ears, now muted by the oppressive quiet that greeted you. Above, the streetlight sputtered, casting halos of sickly yellow light that struggled to hold back the dark. You pulled your jacket tighter, exhaling a misty breath. The streets were emptier than you expected, and even the distant sound of traffic seemed to have abandoned you. You adjusted the strap of your bag and quickened your pace. The only other sound was the muffled echo of your own footsteps, sharp against the damp concrete. But it wasn't long before you noticed another sound, another set of footsteps, almost synchronized with yours, but not quite. A soft thud that fell just out of step with your own. You glanced over your shoulder, scanning the street behind you. A row of parked cars, empty storefronts with metal shutters drawn tight, and a stretch of pavement disappearing into darkness. There was no one there. You shook your head, trying to brush off the feeling that had crept up your spine, and kept walking. But now you couldn't ignore it. The footsteps were there, falling into rhythm with yours again, and whenever you paused, they paused too, as if waiting. Your heart began to race, and a cold sweat broke out along your back. You took a shallow breath and tried to act casual, turning down a side street that would shave a few minutes off your walk home. The street was narrower here, the buildings looming closer, their windows dark and blind. You could almost hear the faint buzz of the street lamp above, and when it flickered, your shadow wavered, splitting into fragments that danced on the walls. You risked another glance behind you, and this time he was there. A man stood beneath the broken light, tall and unmoving. He wore a long, dark coat that seemed to swallow the light, and a wide-brimmed hat obscured most of his face. For a moment you told yourself it was nothing. Just a stranger heading home, just someone who happened to be going the same way. But as you took another step forward, he did too, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The hair on your neck bristled. You picked up your pace, your breath coming faster now. The man mirrored you, closing the distance by fractions. You felt exposed on this narrow street, boxed in by brick walls and abandoned doorways, with nowhere to go but forward. The urge to run clawed at you, but you resisted. Running would make it real, running would confirm that you were prey. The road ahead curved, disappearing from view. You knew this street, it would spill out onto a busier avenue, one that might still have a few late-night stragglers or a passing car. Just a few more steps. But the man's footsteps grew louder, echoing in the hollow silence. You could feel his eyes on you, even though you hadn't seen his face. Your hands trembled as you clenched them into fists. Keep walking. Just keep walking. As you reached the curve, you stumbled over a loose piece of concrete, catching yourself against the rough brick wall. You cursed under your breath and looked back, expecting to see him just feet away. But he wasn't there. The street was empty again, the shadows stretching long and deep. You pressed a hand to your chest, feeling the rapid thud of your heart. Had he ducked into one of the alleys? Was he waiting for you to make a move? You backed away slowly, the wall scraping against your shoulder. The main road was just ahead. If you could reach it, you'd be fine. The lights, the noise, anything would be better than this suffocating silence. You turned and started to jog, your feet pounding against the pavement. Each step was a heartbeat, each breath a desperate gasp. You could almost see the end of the street, the faint glow of neon from the all-night diner, the blur of headlights on the road. And then you heard it. The unmistakable sound of running, fast and hard, closing in behind you. Panic surged through you, and you ran. You didn't look back. Your vision tunneled, the buildings blurring as you pushed yourself faster than you thought possible. The footsteps were deafening now, almost on top of you. You veered to the right, ducking into an alley you barely registered. Trash bags spilled out around you, the sour stench filling your lungs as you stumbled over debris. You pressed yourself against the cold metal of a dumpster, swallowing your ragged breaths, straining to listen. Silence. No footsteps. No movement. Just the distant hum of the main street and the rhythmic pounding of your heart. You waited, every nerve screaming. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. The alley stretched out in either direction, one end opening back onto the street you had fled, the other winding deeper into darkness. You took a hesitant step forward, peeking around the edge of the dumpster. The street was still empty, the broken street lamp flickering weakly. Maybe he had given up. Maybe he had turned back. A shadow shifted at the mouth of the alley. You stumbled back, your hand slipping against the wet pavement. He was there, framed by the streetlight, his silhouette impossibly still. You couldn't make out his face, but you felt his gaze pinning you in place. He didn't move. He just stood, watching. The air felt thick, each breath a struggle. You could hear your own pulse, a frantic drumbeat in your ears. Slowly you rose to your feet, never taking your eyes off him. You needed to think. There had to be another way out, another path. The alley was a dead end on one side, but if you could get past him, if you could reach the street. He took a step forward. Just one, but it was enough. Enough to break the fragile thread of control you had been clinging to. You bolted, your feet slipping on the slick ground as you tore down the alley. The walls closed in around you, graffiti-covered bricks flashing past in a blur. You didn't dare look back. You didn't need to. You could hear him behind you, his steps slow and methodical, as if he knew you had nowhere to go. The alley twisted, branching off into narrower passages. You turned blindly, your breath burning in your lungs. The buildings here were older, their windows broken, their doors chained shut. You caught glimpses of your own reflection in shattered glass, a wild-eyed figure drenched in fear. There had to be a way out. There had to be. A metal gate loomed ahead, rusted and locked. Panic clawed at you. You threw yourself against it, shaking the bars, searching for any weakness. Behind you, the footsteps stopped. You turned slowly, your back pressed against the cold metal. He was there, at the other end of the alley, his shape distorted by the shadows. He took another step, and another, his pace unhurried. "Please," you whispered, the word lost in the night. He kept coming. The shadows seemed to writhe around him, the air thickening with each step. You tried to move, but your legs felt heavy, rooted in place. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that you could see the glint of something metallic in his hand, a knife, or a blade, you couldn't tell. The brim of his hat hid his eyes, but you could feel them on you, cold and unfeeling. He tilted his head, as if considering something, and then he spoke. His voice was low, a rasp that scraped against your nerves. "Why do you run?" The question hung in the air, more unsettling than if he had simply remained silent. There was no trace of emotion in his voice, no hint of mockery or cruelty, just a cold, detached curiosity that made your skin crawl. Your throat tightened, and for a moment you couldn't breathe. Every instinct told you to scream, to lash out, to fight, but your body refused to obey. The alley felt impossibly small, the metal gate pressing against your spine, as if it too wanted to push you into his grasp. "Please," you managed again, your voice cracking. You weren't sure if you were begging for mercy or for an explanation, but he didn't react. The knife in his hand caught the dim light, revealing a jagged, uneven edge. It wasn't a clean weapon, it was crude, meant for tearing. He took another step forward, closing the distance between you, and your mind raced. You couldn't stay here. You couldn't let him come closer. Desperation gave you strength. You dropped to the ground, reaching for a loose piece of broken brick. Your fingers closed around it, scraping against the rough surface as you swung upward with all the force you could muster. It wasn't much. Your movements were wild, fueled more by fear than precision. But it was enough to make him pause. He stepped back, the blade shifting in his grip, and for a split second, you saw hesitation flicker across what little you could see of his face. That split second was all you needed. You scrambled to your feet, adrenaline surging, and bolted down the narrow alleyway that branched to your right. The walls closed in around you, the darkness pressing tight. You could hear him behind you, closer now, his footsteps a relentless drumbeat. But you didn't look back. You focused on the ground beneath your feet, on each uneven step that could send you sprawling. The alley twisted and turned, a labyrinth of brick and shadow. The stench of rotting garbage filled your nose, and you fought the urge to gag. A faint light appeared ahead, a street lamp flickering weakly at the end of the alley. Salvation, or at least a brief reprieve. You pushed yourself harder, every muscle screaming, and burst out onto the street. The sudden brightness was blinding, but you didn't stop. You stumbled onto the sidewalk, gasping for air, and scanned your surroundings. The street was deserted, lined with shuttered businesses and abandoned cars. No one to help, no one to call out to. The realization hit you like a punch to the gut, but you couldn't afford to dwell on it. You spun around, expecting to see him emerging from the darkness. But the alley remained empty, the shadows still. The silence was deafening. You took a few shaky steps backward, your eyes never leaving the alley's mouth. Was he toying with you? Had he slipped away into another path, waiting to ambush you further down the road? The thought sent a chill down your spine. A sudden rustling to your left made you jump, and you turned sharply, your makeshift weapon raised. It was just a stray cat, its eyes glowing eerily in the dim light. It hissed before darting away, disappearing into the night. You lowered the brick, your arm trembling. Your mind was a whirlwind of fear and exhaustion. You needed to get home. You needed to find safety, to lock the door behind you and pretend this nightmare was over. But you knew it wasn't. Not yet. You forced yourself to move, one step at a time, down the empty street. Each step echoed, each breath a struggle. The buildings loomed around you, their windows dark and watchful. You crossed the street, your gaze flicking to every alley, every doorway. The man could be anywhere. He could be watching, waiting for you to let your guard down. You tried to steady your breathing, to think clearly, but your thoughts were a tangle of fear and doubt. You reached for your phone, fumbling with numb fingers, only to realize it was dead. Of course it was. You had been out all night, draining the battery without a second thought. Now it felt like the last fragile thread connecting you to the outside world had snapped. You shoved it back into your pocket, swallowing a wave of despair. You were alone. A low, metallic clang echoed from behind you. You whipped around, heart hammering. An empty can rolled across the pavement, pushed by a gust of wind. Nothing else, but the noise had been too loud, too deliberate. You backed away slowly, your senses on high alert. The buildings seemed to close in, the shadows deepening. You scanned the street, searching for any sign of movement. And then you saw him. He was standing at the far end of the street, partially obscured by a broken lamppost. His posture was relaxed, almost casual, as if he was simply out for an evening stroll. But there was nothing casual about the way he watched you, his head tilted slightly, as if assessing your every move. The knife was still in his hand, glinting under the weak light. You couldn't tell if he was smiling, but you could feel the malice radiating from him. He took a step forward, then another. You turned and ran. This time you didn't care about preserving any shred of composure. You sprinted down the street, your legs burning, your breath coming in ragged gasps. The buildings blurred past you, indistinct shapes in the periphery. You were running blind, driven by sheer terror. You rounded a corner and nearly collided with a metal fence. It stretched across the alley, too high to climb, too solid to break through. Panic clawed at you. You turned, searching for another way out, but the only path was back the way you had come. A shadow fell over the mouth of the alley. He stood there, blocking your escape. This time he didn't rush. He didn't need to. He stepped forward slowly, the knife loose in his hand, as if savoring the moment. You backed away until your shoulders pressed against the fence. There was nowhere to go. No more tricks, no more desperate escapes. He had you. You put up a good chase, he said, his voice low and almost amused. He took another step, closing the gap. But it always ends the same. You tightened your grip on the brick, your knuckles white. You wouldn't go down without a fight. Every muscle in your body tensed, waiting for him to make his move. The air between you was electric, charged with the inevitability of violence. And then, a sound you didn't expect, a faint wail, rising in pitch. Sirens. The distant wail of approaching sirens. The man paused, his head snapping toward the noise. Something shifted in his stance, a flicker of annoyance or perhaps even fear. The spell broke. You lunged, swinging the brick with all your strength. It connected with his arm, knocking the knife loose. He staggered back, and you didn't wait to see what he would do next. You pushed past him, your shoulders slamming into his chest, and ran. You ran until your lungs burned and the world blurred around you. The sirens grew louder, closer, a beacon in the darkness. You stumbled toward the sound, desperate and half-blinded by tears. Somewhere behind you, the man's footsteps faded into the night. Whether he had fled or simply melted back into the shadows, you didn't know. You didn't care. All that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between you and him. You burst onto a wider street, gasping for air, and saw the flashing lights of a police car rounding the corner. You waved frantically, your body trembling. The car screeched to a halt, and an officer stepped out, his face a mixture of concern and confusion. You tried to speak, but the words stuck in your throat. All you could do was point back toward the alley, your hand shaking. The officer called for backup and moved past you, his radio crackling. You sank to your knees, the adrenaline finally crashing. Your body felt heavy, every limb leaden. You listened to the faint sound of footsteps receding, the murmur of voices as more officers arrived. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows darker than before. Eventually they told you the alley was empty. No sign of the man, no sign of the knife, just darkness and echoes. You barely registered their words, their questions blurring together as they tried to piece together what had happened. Your body was still trembling, and the cold seeped through your bones. You told them everything you could, every detail of the man, every step you had taken to escape him. But as you spoke, a heavy, sinking feeling settled in your chest. The officers exchanged glances you couldn't decipher, and their questions shifted, becoming gentler, almost patronizing. "Are you sure you didn't see anyone else?" one of them asked, his tone careful, as if he were speaking to a child. "No one else in the alley?" You stared at him, trying to process his words. "He was there, you insisted. He had a knife. He followed me." Another officer, a woman with tired eyes, crouched next to you. "We believe you," she said, but there was something in her eyes, something that made you feel small and exposed. "We'll keep looking. Right now, we need to get you somewhere safe." The ride to the station was a blur. They offered you coffee, asked you to describe him again and again. You did, every time, but each repetition made the memory feel thinner, less substantial. By the time they let you leave, dawn was breaking, painting the sky with pale, fragile light. An officer drove you home, offering words of reassurance that felt hollow. "We'll patrol the area," he promised. "If he's out there, we'll find him." But you knew better. You had seen the way they looked at you, like you were a scared animal, cornered and half mad. They didn't believe you, not really. Maybe they thought you were drunk, or that you'd imagined it. You stumbled into your apartment, locking every bolt behind you, and collapsed onto the floor. The exhaustion hit you all at once, pulling you under. You woke up hours later, disoriented and aching. The sunlight streaming through the window felt wrong, too bright, too indifferent. You dragged yourself to the bathroom, splashing cold water on your face. For a moment, you stared at your reflection. Dark circles rimmed your eyes, and your skin was pale and drawn. You almost didn't recognize yourself. You tried to go about your day, to convince yourself that it was over. You jumped at every sound, every shadow. When your phone buzzed, you nearly dropped it. It was a message from a friend, asking if you were okay. The words felt distant, like they belonged to someone else's life. You didn't respond. You couldn't. The events of the night replayed in your mind on a loop: the man's relentless pursuit, the glint of his knife, the way he seemed to disappear into the shadows. You spent the rest of the day in a haze, checking the locks on your doors and windows again and again. When night fell, the fear returned in full force. You turned on every light in the apartment, but it didn't help. The shadows still found places to hide. You tried to sleep, but every time you closed your eyes, you heard his footsteps, felt his gaze. The hours dragged by, each one heavier than the last. Sometime past midnight, you heard a noise outside your window, a faint scraping sound. Your breath caught in your throat. You forced yourself to move, to peek through the blinds. The street below was empty. Just the wind, you told yourself. Just your imagination. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and exhaustion. You barely left your apartment, jumping at every sound. You checked the locks constantly, your paranoia growing. The police called once to follow up, but there was nothing new to report. No leads, no sightings. The man had vanished, like he'd never existed at all. You tried to convince yourself it was over, that you were safe, but deep down, you knew it wasn't true. One evening, a few days later, you forced yourself to go out. The walls of your apartment felt too close, the air too thick. You needed to breathe, to convince yourself that the world hadn't completely changed. You stuck to crowded streets, the noise and movement of fragile comfort. Every face you passed was a potential threat, every shadow a hiding place. You turned corners quickly, your eyes scanning for any sign of him. Eventually, you found yourself at a small cafe. It was mostly empty, the air warm and heavy with the scent of coffee. You sat by the window, your back to the wall, and tried to calm the pounding in your chest. For a while, it almost worked. You sipped your drink, watching people pass by outside, their lives continuing as if nothing had happened. You wanted to feel normal again, to pretend that you hadn't been marked by something dark and inexplicable. But then you saw him. He was across the street, leaning against a lamppost. The brim of his hat cast a shadow over his face, but there was no mistaking him. The knife was gone, but it didn't matter. He didn't move, didn't make any attempt to cross the street. He just stood there, watching, waiting. Your blood ran cold. The cup slipped from your fingers, shattering on the floor. The few patrons in the cafe turned to look, their expressions curious, but you barely noticed. Your gaze was locked on him. You wanted to run, to scream, but your body wouldn't move. He tilted his head, just like before, and a sickening realization washed over you. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. You forced yourself to stand, your legs weak and unsteady. The cafe door felt miles away, each step a monumental effort. You kept your eyes on him, half expecting him to vanish the moment you looked away. But he remained, a dark presence that refused to let you go. When you finally stepped outside, the cold air hit you like a slap. You turned to face him, your heart pounding. But the sidewalk was empty. He was gone. Panic clawed at you. You spun in circles, searching for any sign of him. Nothing, just strangers going about their lives, oblivious to the terror that had taken root in yours. You stumbled away from the cafe, your breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He was playing with you. He wanted you to know he could find you, that no amount of light or noise or people could keep him away. You made it home somehow, though you couldn't remember the journey. The locks clicked shut behind you, and you pressed your back against the door, sliding down to the floor. You couldn't keep living like this. You needed to do something to take back control. But what? The police didn't believe you. No one would. To them, he was a ghost, a figment of your fear. But you knew he was real. You could still feel his eyes on you. The hours stretched on, each one darker than the last. You sat in the dim light of your apartment, your mind racing. And then you heard a faint scraping sound, just like before. This time it was coming from inside. The sound was soft but unmistakable, a slow, deliberate scraping that sent a shiver down your spine. You froze, every nerve on edge, straining to pinpoint the source. It seemed to echo through the apartment, bouncing off the walls and settling like a weight in your chest. You told yourself it couldn't be real. Your mind was playing tricks on you, twisting your fear into something tangible. But deep down, you knew better. You rose slowly, careful not to make a sound. Your heart pounded in your ears, each beat a deafening drum. You moved through the apartment on trembling legs, checking every room, every shadowed corner. The kitchen was empty. The bathroom too. You forced yourself to push open the closet door, half expecting to find him there, waiting. But it was just clothes and dust, the mundane trappings of your life now tainted by terror. The scraping continued, louder now. It was coming from the living room. You gripped the first thing you could find, a heavy glass vase, and crept toward the sound. The air felt thick, every breath a struggle. As you approached the living room, you noticed something that made your blood run cold. The window was open. You were certain you had locked it. You always locked it. A chill breeze blew through the room, rustling the curtains. The scraping stopped. You stood in the doorway, paralyzed, your gaze fixed on the window. The silence pressed down on you, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, deliberately, the curtain shifted. He was there. You barely had time to register his presence before he moved, a dark blur of motion that crossed the room in an instant. You stumbled back, raising the vase, but he caught your wrist, his grip like iron. The vase slipped from your hand, shattering on the floor. You struggled, twisting and kicking, but he was too strong. He forced you back against the wall, his face inches from yours. The brim of his hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but you could feel the coldness radiating from him. "Why are you doing this?" you gasped, your voice raw with fear and desperation. He didn't answer. His grip tightened, cutting off the blood flow to your hand. You felt lightheaded, the edges of your vision blurring. He leaned in closer, and for the first time you saw his eyes cold, pale, and utterly devoid of mercy. There was no hatred in them, no rage, just a chilling indifference, as if you were nothing more than an insect to be crushed. You lashed out with your free hand, clawing at his face. Your nails caught skin, drawing blood, and for a split second his grip loosened. You seized the opportunity, twisting free and stumbling toward the door. He was on you in an instant, yanking you back by the hair. Pain exploded in your scalp, and you screamed, the sound tearing through the silence of the room. He dragged you toward the window, his movements methodical. Panic surged through you. You clawed at the floor, at anything you could reach, but it was useless. He was going to throw you out. You could see it in the way he moved, in the way he didn't bother to speak or gloat. He was focused, determined, and there was no escape. Then a sudden crash shattered the moment, a door being kicked in, the sound of heavy footsteps. Voices shouting, orders being barked. Light flooded the room, blinding and harsh. The man released you, spinning around to face the intruders. You collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, your vision swimming. The police had come. Someone must have heard the struggle, the shattering glass, and called for help. Officers filled the room, weapons drawn, their faces hard and uncompromising. The man didn't flinch. He moved with a speed and precision that was almost inhuman, ducking and weaving as they closed in. For a moment it seemed like he might escape, slipping through their grasp like a shadow. But there were too many of them, and he had nowhere to go. They brought him down with a brutal efficiency that left no room for doubt. His hat was knocked from his head, revealing a face that was both ordinary and utterly unremarkable, a face you might pass on the street without a second glance. He didn't struggle. He didn't speak. He just stared at you, his eyes empty, as they dragged him away. You couldn't move. The world felt distant, muffled, as if you were underwater. An officer knelt beside you, his expression softening. He said something words meant to comfort, to reassure, but you couldn't hear him. All you could see was the man's face, burned into your memory like a brand. They told you it was over. They said you were safe now, but deep down you knew the truth. The way he had looked at you, the calm, detached certainty in his eyes, it wasn't the look of a man who had been defeated. It was the look of a man who was already planning his next move. Even as they took him away, you could feel it. This wasn't over. It would never be over. The days that followed were a blur of police interviews and restless nights. They tried to give you answers, to explain who he was and why he had done it. But there were no answers, just a tangled mess of dead ends and half-truths. No one knew who he was. No one knew where he had come from. He had no name, no history. Just a trail of fear and violence that stretched back further than anyone could trace. And then, one night, you woke to the sound of footsteps outside your window. Slow, deliberate footsteps. You didn't dare move. You didn't dare breathe. The scraping sound began again, soft and familiar. This time you knew he was waiting for you to look. You lay there in the dark, your breath caught in your throat. The scraping sound continued, a maddening rhythm that cut through the silence. Each scratch against the window pane sent a shockwave of fear through your body. You tried to tell yourself it couldn't be real. The man was gone, locked away, a dozen miles from here, surrounded by guards and steel bars. They had promised you were safe, but you knew better. Promises meant nothing. He had made sure of that. You forced yourself to move, each inch feeling like a monumental effort. Your body was stiff, every muscle screaming in protest. The floorboards creaked as you swung your legs over the side of the bed. The room was dark, the shadows deep and suffocating. Your hand reached for the lamp, but you hesitated. Light would make you visible. Light would show him exactly where you were. The scraping stopped. You froze, the silence pressing down on you. You could hear your own heartbeat, a frantic drumbeat in your chest. Was he still there? Was he waiting for you to make a move? Every nerve in your body was on edge, every instinct screaming at you to run, to hide, to do something, anything, but you couldn't. Fear had pinned you in place. And then, a faint tap at the window. Just once. A soft, deliberate knock. It took everything you had to stand, to cross the room on unsteady legs. The air felt heavy, each step a struggle. When you reached the window, you hesitated. Your hand hovered over the edge of the curtain, trembling. If you pulled it back, you would have to see. You would have to face whatever was waiting on the other side. But you couldn't stay in the darkness forever. He had already taken so much from you. He wouldn't take this too. You took a deep breath and yanked the curtain aside. Nothing. The window was empty, the street below bathed in pale moonlight. The branches of a nearby tree swayed in the wind, their shadows dancing across the glass. You pressed your forehead to the cool pane, relief flooding through you. It had been your imagination, a cruel trick of fear and exhaustion. You let out a shaky laugh, tears stinging your eyes. And then you saw it. Etched into the glass, faint but unmistakable, were words, "I'll be back." Your breath caught in your throat. You stumbled back, tripping over your own feet, and fell hard onto the floor. The message glared at you, taunting, undeniable. He had been here. He had touched this window, stood where you now stood. And he had left a promise you couldn't ignore. The next days passed in a blur. The police came, examined the window, and assured you it was impossible. The man was still in custody. He hadn't escaped. There was no evidence that he had been anywhere near you. They said it was a sick joke, maybe a prank by someone who had heard about your ordeal, but you saw the doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe their own words. How could they? You barely slept, barely ate. You moved through your days like a ghost, waiting for the next sign. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every shadow in your peripheral vision made you jump. You became a prisoner in your own home, trapped by fear and the knowledge that he was still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. One night, exhaustion finally claimed you, and you drifted into a restless sleep. You dreamed of dark alleys and the scrape of metal on glass. In the dream you were running, your feet pounding against wet pavement, the sound of footsteps closing in behind you. No matter how fast you ran, you couldn't escape. He was always there, just out of reach. You woke to the sound of your phone vibrating on the nightstand. The screen glowed with an unknown number. You hesitated, your heart racing. Something in the pit of your stomach told you not to answer, but your fingers moved on their own, swiping across the screen. Hello. There was silence on the other end. You strained to hear, every muscle tensed. Then, a low, familiar voice, cold and detached, just like before. Why do you run? The line went dead. You stared at the phone, your hands shaking. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be him. You checked the call log, hoping you had imagined it, but the number was there. No name, just a string of digits that meant nothing. You called the police again, desperate for answers. They traced the call, but it led nowhere. A disposable phone, untraceable. They promised to increase patrols around your building, but you knew it wouldn't matter. He always found a way. The fear became your constant companion. You changed your routine, never taking the same path twice. You kept your head down, avoided eye contact, and jumped at every shadow. But no matter what you did, the feeling never went away, the sense that he was just a step behind, waiting for you to let your guard down. Weeks passed. The world moved on, but you were stuck, trapped in a cycle of fear and paranoia. People started to notice. Friends drifted away, their concern giving way to frustration. They told you to move on, to let it go. But how could you? How could you pretend it was over when every night you heard the scraping sound outside your window, felt his eyes on you in every crowded street? One night, as you walked home from the corner store, you felt it again, that familiar, suffocating presence. You quickened your pace, your breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The streets were empty, the streetlights casting long shadows. You turned a corner, and there he was, standing at the end of the block. He didn't move. He just watched, his silhouette dark against the dim light. Something inside you snapped. You couldn't keep running. You couldn't keep living like this. You turned and ran, not away, but toward him. Each step brought you closer, your fear giving way to something else. Anger. Desperation. You were tired of being hunted. Tired of being afraid. But as you closed the distance, he stepped back, melting into the shadows. You stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath. He was gone. Again. Always just out of reach, always in control. You sank to your knees, the weight of it all crashing down on you. He wasn't just trying to hurt you. He was trying to break you, to make you doubt your own mind. And he was succeeding. That night you made a decision. You wouldn't let him win. You wouldn't let him take any more from you. You started to fight back, learning everything you could about him, about his methods, about the way he moved and thought. You trained, prepared, turned your fear into fuel. You knew it wouldn't be enough. He was always a step ahead. But you had to try. Because one day he would come back, and when he did, you would be ready. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation and exhaustion. You threw yourself into the task of fortifying your life, driven by a mix of fear and defiance. Every moment felt like a countdown, a race against the inevitable. You changed the locks on your doors, reinforced your windows, and installed cameras that watched every angle of your apartment. The light of the monitors became your new companion, bathing the room in a cold glow that never felt comforting. You trained too. It was a laughable thought, at first a desperate attempt to reclaim some illusion of control. But desperation was a powerful motivator. You signed up for self-defense classes, memorized escape routes, practiced gripping a knife with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Every night you pushed yourself to exhaustion, collapsing into bed with the hope that sleep would grant you a few hours of peace. But it never did. The dreams were always there, dark alleys, closing footsteps, his face inches from yours. And when you woke, gasping for air, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, the silence pressing in. You were haunted, hunted even when he wasn't there. And he wasn't there. Not physically, not that you could see. But his presence lingered like a shadow you couldn't shake. You never knew when he might appear. At first there were the calls, brief, silent, and always from an unknown number. You stopped answering your phone, but it didn't help. The messages would come anyway. Sometimes you would find your door ajar, though you were certain you had locked it. Sometimes you'd return home to find small things moved, a cup turned upside down, a chair slightly out of place. Always subtle, always just enough to remind you that he was out there, that he could reach you whenever he wanted. The police tried to help at first. They increased patrols, stationed officers outside your building. But nothing happened while they were around. The moment they left, the signs would appear again, a scratch on your door, a dead rat left in the hallway, a knife stabbed into the floor. They stopped coming after a while. They had other cases, other people to protect. You couldn't blame them. To them, he was just a ghost, a phantom without motive or pattern. But to you, he was a constant presence, an ever-looming threat. One evening you came home to find a note waiting for you, pinned to your front door with a thin, rusted blade. The sight of it made your blood run cold. You glanced over your shoulder, half expecting to see him standing in the shadows, but the hallway was empty. Trembling, you reached for the note, the paper rough against your fingers. There were only 3 words, scrawled in uneven letters, almost time now. You ripped the note down, your hands shaking so hard you could barely hold it. This was different. This was a warning, a promise. You knew he was coming, but this was a reminder that you wouldn't know when. You'd spent weeks preparing, steeling yourself for this moment, but the reality of it threatened to overwhelm you. He was coming, and you might not survive it. The next day, you packed a bag and left the apartment. You couldn't stay there, waiting for him to strike. You needed space, time to think. You drove for hours, the road stretching endlessly ahead of you, the trees on either side blurring into dark walls. When you finally stopped, it was at a small motel off the highway, a place that felt as isolated and forgotten as you did. You paid in cash, used a fake name. The room was cold and musty, the walls thin enough to hear every creak and shuffle from the rooms next door. But it was somewhere he wouldn't expect you to be. You spent the night in the corner, your back against the wall, the knife you'd brought clutched in your hand. Sleep was impossible. Every sound made you jump. Every flicker of movement outside the window sent your heart racing. The second night was the same. And the third. You were running on fumes, your body ready to collapse, but you couldn't let your guard down. Not even for a moment. It was on the 4th night that you heard a faint tapping on the motel door. You shot to your feet, knife in hand, your pulse hammering in your ears. The tapping continued, soft and patient. You moved closer, keeping to the shadows. "Who's there?" you demanded, your voice cracking. Silence. Then, a low chuckle that turned your blood to ice. You stepped back, your grip tightening on the knife. The door rattled as if he were testing the lock. Panic surged through you. This was it. He had found you. All the preparation, the running, it hadn't been enough. The door flew open. the flimsy lock snapping under the force. He stepped inside, his silhouette dark against the pale light of the hallway. He didn't rush you. He closed the door behind him with a deliberate slowness, the click echoing through the small room. His eyes found yours, cold and empty. You saw the knife in his hand, the same knife he'd left buried in your floor. For a moment, neither of you moved. The air between you was electric, charged with all the fear and tension of the past months. Then he lunged. You dodged, barely, the blade slicing through the air where your head had been. You lashed out with your own knife, your movements wild and desperate. He sidestepped easily, his expression unreadable. This was a game to him. He had been waiting for this moment, savoring it. You could see it in the way he moved, in the way he toyed with you. But you weren't going to play his game. You feinted left, then threw yourself at him, catching him off guard. You both crashed to the floor, the impact knocking the wind from your lungs. He recovered quickly, twisting beneath you, but you held on. You drove your knee into his side, felt him grunt. His hand shot out, grabbing your wrist, twisting it, until you thought the bone would snap. The knife fell from your grasp, clattering to the floor. He loomed over you, his weight crushing the air from your lungs. The knife in his hand glinted, poised to strike. You thrashed, clawing at him, fighting with everything you had. You wouldn't let him win. Not like this. You found his face, dug your fingers into his eyes. He screamed a raw, inhuman sound, and you used the moment of weakness to push him off. You scrambled to your feet, your vision swimming. He was already recovering, the knife still clutched in his hand. Blood streamed down his face, but it didn't slow him. He lunged again, and this time you were ready. You sidestepped, grabbing the lamp from the nightstand and swinging it with all your strength. It connected with his head, shattering on impact. He stumbled, the knife slipping from his grasp. You didn't hesitate. You grabbed the fallen knife and turned it on him. For the first time you saw something flicker in his eyes, surprise, maybe fear. You drove the blade into his side, felt the resistance as it cut through flesh. He gasped, his body convulsing. You pulled the knife free and stepped back, your chest heaving. He fell to his knees, one hand clutching the wound. Blood pooled around him, dark and slick. He looked up at you, his expression unreadable. "It doesn't end," he whispered, his voice weak but certain. "You know that." You stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. He smiled, a cruel, blood-stained smile, and then he collapsed. The room was silent, the air heavy with the scent of blood and fear. You stood there, knife in hand, waiting for him to move, but he didn't. Minutes passed, and still, he didn't move. The realization hit you slowly. It was over. He was dead. But his words lingered. "It doesn't end." You knew what he meant. The scars he left, the fear he had planted, they would never truly go away. You would carry them forever. You walked out of the motel room, the weight of it all pressing down on you. The night was dark and cold, but for the first time in months, you felt the faintest glimmer of relief. You had survived, you had fought back. But as you stepped into the shadows, you couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, somehow, he was still watching, still waiting.